She's only after my wealth, Julian sneered. The corner of his mouth pulled into a smirk that was as carefully polished as his $1,000 Italian leather shoes. His voice, the same voice that once wove passionate visions of our future and held me captive, now cut through the hushed air of the courtroom with a cold, metallic ring. She never even worked a real job. The silence that crashed down in the wake of his words was absolute. It was a physical weight, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed the air from my lungs. 7 years of my life, a frantic juggling act of double shifts and late-night drives, of ferrying strangers through the sleeping city, of lonely dinners heated in a microwave. All of it, every sacrifice, every ounce of effort was just erased. It was rendered a punchline, a joke delivered by the very man whose life I had single-handedly propped up and built from scratch. In the gallery, seated directly behind Julian, his mother, Eleanor, gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. Her perfectly manicured fingers, each nail a slash of blood red, tapped a quiet, self-satisfied rhythm on the gleaming wood of the spectator bench. Next to Julian, his lead attorney, a bulldog of a man named Lawrence Harrington, theatrically shuffled a stack of papers, every so often casting a look of pitying condescension in my direction. My legs felt like they might give out, like they were made of nothing more than gelatin, but somehow I forced myself to stand. A tremor shot through my entire body, a visible quake of nerves and rage. But when I finally spoke, my voice was a clear, steady bell that sliced through the thick, judgmental silence. "Your Honor," I said, my eyes fixed on the impassive face of Judge Harrison, "I'd like to submit this prenuptial agreement from Paris." A collective gasp swept through the room. It was a physical sound, a palpable wave of shock that you could almost feel on your skin. I watched as every last drop of color drained from Julian's face. The smugness, the polished arrogance, it all vanished, replaced by a look of dawning, sickening horror. It was as if the ghost of a wine-soaked night in a tiny Montmartre bistro 7 years ago had just materialized in the courtroom to slap him sober, far, far too late. But before I get to the end of this story and explain how that single piece of paper upended everything, I need to take you back to the beginning. I was 28 years old when I first laid eyes on Julian Croft. It was at a crowded dinner party hosted by a mutual friend, the kind of downtown apartment that buzzed with the high-strung energy of ambition and the scent of cheap red wine. Back then, I was Alara Vance, a rising star at Apex Capital Partners. I had a corner office with a panoramic view of the Port Meridian skyline and a salary that finally allowed my blue-collar parents to exhale with a deep sigh of relief. Just that very morning, my boss had called me into his glass-walled office to tell me I was being recommended for the firm's exclusive executive training program. It was the first major rung on the ladder to senior management. "You're going places, Vance," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder with a paternal pride. "Not many analysts get this shot before they hit 30. Don't screw it up." That night, feeling like I was on top of the world, I found myself listening as Julian held court in the center of the living room. He spoke about his idea for a tech startup, and there was a fire in his eyes that was utterly magnetic. He described an inventory management system, something he was calling Innovate Logistics, that he swore would completely revolutionize how small businesses operate. The entire room seemed to lean in, captivated, as he detailed the complex algorithms, the untapped market potential, the incredible shining future he saw with such perfect clarity. The problem, he admitted to me later when we'd found a moment of quiet on the small balcony overlooking the glittering city lights, was capital. "No one wants to throw money at a concept, no matter how brilliant it is," he said, his voice laced with a raw frustration that felt deeply personal, almost like a wound. They want a finished product. They want a proven success. 3 months later, we were lost in a romance so intense it felt like it was rewriting my very DNA. Then Julian's old, battered laptop, the one that held every single line of code he'd ever written, finally gave up the ghost. He was completely devastated, utterly unable to afford a replacement powerful enough to handle his complex work. Without a single second of hesitation, I walked into an electronics store and bought him the latest, most powerful model on the market. "You're investing in our future," he'd whispered against my hair that night, kissing me with a desperate fervor that left me breathless and dizzy. "I swear to you, Alara, I'll pay you back 1,000 times over." By the 6-month mark of our relationship, Julian had quit his soul-crushing IT consulting job to dedicate every waking hour to innovate logistics. His meager savings account evaporated in a matter of weeks. The meetings with potential investors became a revolving door of polite rejections and hollow, empty promises. I found myself picking up the financial slack, first by just covering a larger share of our shared expenses. Then, almost before I knew it, I was paying his rent, his car payment, and for the cheap instant ramen we'd eat for dinner while he promised me, with that unwavering fire in his eyes, that it was all just temporary. "Once we land that seed money, Alara," he'd say, his gaze shining with that same unshakable belief, "everything is going to change for us." A year into our relationship, we were engaged, and I found myself standing at the biggest crossroads of my life. Apex Capital was sending its executive trainees to London for a year-long intensive program. It was the dream. It was the fast track to the career I had worked so tirelessly to build for myself. Going meant climbing the corporate ladder faster than any of my peers. But staying meant supporting Julian's dream, which by that point felt so inextricably linked with my own that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "I'd get it if you went," he told me one evening. His words said one thing, but his slumped shoulders and the haunted, desperate look in his eyes screamed another. I declined the transfer. 2 weeks later, my position at Apex was officially restructured, which was the polite corporate way of telling me I had made my choice and was no longer on the fast track to anywhere. They were showing me the door. I came home that day and sobbed in his arms, the loss of my career a physical, gut-wrenching ache in my chest. "Maybe it's a blessing in disguise," Julian suggested, holding me tight against him. "Now you can really help me build our company." What came next was a slow, grinding descent into a life I could never have imagined for myself. First, I took a job as an administrative assistant at a local medical clinic. The salary was less than half of what I used to make. When that proved to be insufficient to cover Julian's spiraling prototype development costs and conference fees, I started picking up weekend shifts as a waitress at the old Oakwood Diner on the other side of town. Soon after that, I was even driving for a rideshare service on weeknights, spending my evenings shuttling strangers from one end of the city to the other after my day job ended. The humiliation was a constant bitter pill I had to swallow every day. Every so often, one of my old successful colleagues from Apex would slide into the back seat of my worn-out sedan, their eyes widening in a flash of embarrassed recognition. "Alara, is that you? I thought you were on the executive track." I'd force a bright, brittle smile and launch into the rehearsed speech I had perfected over the months. I was supporting my fiancé's incredible startup, I'd explain. I was an early investor in our future. They would nod with a forced, awkward sympathy, but I saw the pity in their eyes, and it felt like being branded with a hot iron. Meanwhile, Julian was a ghost in our own small apartment. He was locked away in the spare bedroom we'd converted into his office, working 18-hour days fueled by caffeine and ambition. He would emerge only for coffee refills and to grab the plate of food I'd leave for him outside his door, his eyes bloodshot and glued to a screen. On the rare nights we were both awake and in the same room, he would talk excitedly about coding breakthroughs and promising investor calls, all while I soaked my swollen, aching feet in a plastic basin of hot water, trying to mentally calculate how to make our shoestring budget stretch for one more month. We got married at the city courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon. The only guest was his mother, Eleanor. My own family couldn't understand my choices. They couldn't begin to fathom why I had thrown away a six-figure career and a bright future for a man with what my father bluntly and repeatedly called pie-in-the-sky ideas. My sister's last real words to me during a tense, tearful phone call were a stark warning. "You're throwing away everything you worked for, Ilara. For him." Eleanor had never approved of me. From the very moment we met, her thin-lipped smile and her cold, appraising gaze made it perfectly clear she believed her genius son had married far, far beneath his station. "Julian needs a partner who can truly comprehend his genius," she'd say, her eyes lingering on my worn-out waitress uniform with a poorly veiled disdain. "Someone who can match his ambition, not just support him financially." For our honeymoon, Julian surprised me by announcing we were going to Paris. He'd finally managed to secure a meeting with a French investor who, he claimed, was so impressed with the concept that they'd agreed to cover our travel costs. "We deserve this break, Ilara," he insisted, his excitement so infectious that it momentarily papered over my exhaustion. But even in the most romantic city in the world, a tiny seed of doubt had taken root in my heart. While Julian celebrated the potential deal with expensive wine he wasn't paying for, a quiet, cold feeling of unease settled over me. It was then that I remembered a recommendation from an old friend from law school, a piece of advice I had long since forgotten. The next morning, while Julian was nursing a massive hangover with black coffee and a handful of aspirin, I met with a Monsieur Dubois, a lawyer specializing in international contracts. Sitting in his quiet, book-lined office on a side street near the Seine, I laid out my entire story. Together, we drafted a prenuptial agreement. It was a document that explicitly acknowledged my extensive and ongoing financial contributions to the founding of Innovate Logistics. More importantly, it categorized those contributions as sweat equity. It established me as a 49% owner of the company and all its related intellectual property. We also included a crucial clause, one that stated my ownership stake would be recognized independently of any future divorce settlement. That evening, amidst another round of celebratory champagne and free-flowing wine, I presented the document to Julian. I told him it was just some standard investment paperwork the French investor required for his records before wiring the funds. Julian, too caught up in the thrill of the moment and far too intoxicated to bother reading the fine print, signed it with a theatrical looping flourish. "To our future," he toasted, raising his glass high, completely and utterly oblivious to what he had just agreed to. Back in Port Meridian, the grueling, relentless pattern of our lives continued. I worked, he coded, and slowly, agonizingly, his business began to gain traction. A small angel investment here, a new beta tester there. After 3 long years of constant, unending struggle, Innovate Logistics finally landed its first real paying client. But as the business started to improve, our relationship began to crumble. Julian started staying at the office overnight, citing urgent deadlines and server crashes. He hired an assistant, a young woman named Chloe, whose primary qualifications seemed to be more aesthetic than administrative. Eleanor became an increasingly constant presence in our lives, often dropping by the office to help with client relations and offer her unsolicited advice. "You wouldn't understand the business aspects of this, dear," she told me dismissively one day when I questioned a large, unnecessary expense on the company credit card. "It's best to leave these things to those of us who do." By the 5th year, I was still working 3 jobs, despite the company's steady and growing success. Julian insisted that every single penny of profit had to be reinvested back into the business. Our apartment remained small and cramped, our car was a secondhand clunker on its last legs, and our lifestyle was relentlessly, punishingly modest. "Sacrifices for the greater good," he would say, his tone final. But I started noticing small, significant changes in him. His suits were suddenly better tailored, custom fit. His watch was suddenly a Swiss luxury brand. His haircuts were from an expensive salon downtown. They were small luxuries, he explained, that were necessary for client impressions. All this while, I was still buying my clothes from thrift stores and clearance racks to wear to my 3 jobs. "Just be patient, Ilara," he'd say, his eyes barely lifting from the glow of his phone. "We're almost there." By the 7th year, I barely recognized either of us. The ambitious financial analyst and the passionate, fiery entrepreneur had been replaced by an exhausted, perpetually tired worker and an increasingly arrogant and distant CEO. The space between us had grown into a vast, silent canyon. We were just strangers sharing an address. I had become invisible. My sacrifices, my contributions, my very presence had all been faded into the background of Julian's carefully curated success story. I just never imagined the final chapter of our story would begin in a sterile, cold courtroom, with the cruel smirk of my husband and his shocking, unbelievable words, "She never even worked a real job." Everything changed on a Tuesday in March. I remember the day so clearly because I had just clocked out from a grueling double shift at the diner when Julian called. His voice was electric, crackling with a kind of unbridled excitement I hadn't heard in years. "We got it, Ilara. We got it. Venture capital funding. $10 million. His words tumbled out in a breathless, triumphant rush. "Anderson Partners is backing us. We're scaling up immediately." I sank onto a hard plastic bus stop bench outside the diner, my exhausted brain struggling to catch up to the sudden shift in our reality. For 7 long years, we had survived on little more than promises and potential. Now, suddenly, it was real. Does this mean I can finally quit one of my jobs?" I asked, a fragile shoot of hope rising in my chest for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line. "Let's not be hasty," he said, his tone shifting instantly from ecstatic to all business. "We need to reinvest everything for maximum growth. But soon, Ilara. I promise." 2 weeks later, Innovate Logistics moved from the spare bedroom of our apartment into a sprawling, glass-walled office space in the prestigious Westbrook Business Park. Julian went on a hiring spree, bringing on a team of developers, marketers, and a full sales staff. He started wearing custom-tailored suits exclusively and came home with stories of business lunches at restaurants where the appetizers cost more than I made in a day. And then came Chloe. "She's the best executive assistant in the industry," Julian explained over a rare, strained dinner we had together. "Her organizational skills are exactly what I need to manage this new phase of growth." Chloe Sterling was 27, a Stanford graduate with gleaming chestnut hair and a wardrobe of sleek, expensive pantsuits that probably cost more than my monthly salary from all 3 of my jobs combined. When I met her for the first time at the company's lavish office warming party, she looked me up and down with an air of cool, professional assessment. "Oh, you're Julian's wife," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "It's so fascinating to finally meet you." He rarely mentions his personal life at the office. The comment stung far more than it should have. I was wearing my best dress, a 3-year-old find from a department store clearance rack, and I was carrying a heavy tray of homemade appetizers I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning preparing between my shifts. "Ilara likes to keep things simple," Julian interjected smoothly, gently taking the tray from my hands. "Chloe, could you do me a favor and show her where to set up the food? I need to go greet the investors from Anderson." I became the wife that evening. I was introduced briefly and then politely shunted to the background while Julian basked in the bright spotlight of his newly expanding universe. Eleanor arrived fashionably late, of course, embracing her son with a dramatic flourish before turning to survey the gathering with a proprietary air. "Darling, this is just the beginning," she gushed, fussing with his tie. "I always knew you were destined for greatness." She gave me a brisk, dismissive nod. "Ilara, the cheese plate needs refreshing. Be a dear." I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, reminding myself that this was Julian's big moment. but something inside me fractured that night. For the very first time, I didn't feel like a partner in his success. I felt like an outsider looking in on someone else's life. The months that followed brought a tidal wave of change. Julian hired a chief financial officer, despite my own extensive finance background and the years I had spent meticulously managing the company's precarious books. "We need someone with enterprise-level experience now," he explained dismissively when I dared to question the decision. "You've done your best, Alara, but we're in the big leagues now." My suggestions about financial strategy, which had once been the bedrock of our planning sessions, were now met with patronizing smiles or were simply ignored outright. Meanwhile, Eleanor started showing up at the office on a regular basis. She inserted herself into meetings and offered unsolicited opinions on everything from marketing campaigns to the color of the lobby walls. "Mother has excellent taste, and she knows all the right people," Julian defended when I questioned her growing and frankly bizarre involvement. "Her connections are opening doors for us." But those doors remained firmly shut to me. When I stopped by the office one afternoon to surprise Julian with lunch, I found the reception area completely transformed. The previously bare walls were now covered with a series of professionally framed photographs documenting the company's meteoric journey. There was Julian pitching to investors, Julian signing the funding deal, Julian cutting the ribbon on the new office, Julian accepting a local business award, 7 years of our shared history, all of it carefully curated to erase any trace of my contribution. "Can I help you?" Chloe's voice was as crisp and professional as her starched white blouse as she emerged from her office, which was conveniently located directly adjacent to Julian's. "I'm here to see my husband," I replied, the words feeling foreign and strange in my mouth. I suddenly felt like I needed an appointment to see the man I was married to. "He's in meetings all afternoon," she said, her tone implying that I should have known better than to just show up. "Perhaps you should have called first." At home, Julian began working later and later. His explanations for his absences evolved from apologetic to matter-of-fact, and finally to irritated whenever I questioned him. "Building a company of this scale requires sacrifice, Alara. Surely you, of all people, understand that." One night, utterly exhausted from a full day at the clinic followed by a dinner shift at the diner, I fell asleep on the couch waiting for him to come home. His phone, which he'd left behind in his rush that morning, pinged with a notification, lighting up the darkroom. It was a text from Chloe. "Working late again tonight. Ordered dinner from Maison for us. Your favorite booth in the back." My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot of dread. I scrolled up. There were dozens of exchanges, growing increasingly familiar and intimate. Inside jokes, compliments on his appearance, late-night messages that no executive assistant ever needed to send to her boss. When I confronted him, his denial was too quick, too practiced. "She's just being professional, anticipating my needs." That's literally her job, Alara. At midnight? By commenting on how good you looked in your blue suit? His expression hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You're being ridiculous. This is exactly why I can't discuss the business with you anymore. You're too emotional, too small-minded to understand." The man who had once praised my financial acumen now spoke to me as if I were a hysterical, irrational child. The shift had been subtle at first, a condescending tone here, a dismissive eye roll there, but now it was accelerating at a terrifying pace. My birthday passed without so much as a card. Our anniversary became, in his words, just another Tuesday. When his company was featured in a regional business magazine, a glossy 4-page spread celebrating his solo journey to success, my name wasn't mentioned a single time. "They interviewed you for 3 hours, I said, my voice flat as I stared at the pictures of Julian, Chloe, and Eleanor, posing together like a happy family in the gleaming new office. "You never mentioned me." "Not once?" He shrugged, barely looking up from his laptop. "It wasn't relevant to the business narrative. 7 years of my life, dismissed as irrelevant." The final, brutal confirmation came when I borrowed his laptop to pay our bills, a task I still handled despite the company's roaring success. Minimized in the corner of the screen was an open document. It was a lease agreement for a luxury penthouse apartment downtown, effective immediately. That night, Julian didn't come home until 3 a.m. When he did, he smelled of expensive perfume I didn't own and offered a string of rehearsed excuses. The next morning, he said it flatly, without emotion. "This isn't working anymore, Alara. We just want different things." "We?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Or you and Chloe?" His silence was the only answer I needed. 2 days later, he moved out. 3 weeks after that, the divorce papers arrived. They were delivered by a courier while I was in the back room of the diner, tying on my stained apron for the dinner rush. The grounds cited were irreconcilable differences. The terms offered were a generous, one-time settlement that amounted to less than 6 months of his new, astronomical salary. When I called Julian, my hands shaking with a mixture of disbelief and rage, Eleanor answered his phone. "He's very busy," she said, the satisfaction in her voice as sharp and clear as glass. "The lawyers will handle everything from here on out. Though frankly, dear, you should be grateful for his generosity. What exactly did you contribute besides being a temporary support system?" As I hung up the phone, a memory surfaced, pushing its way through the fog of my grief. The prenup from Paris. It was still sealed in its original manila envelope, hidden away inside my old financial textbook from college. It was the one book in our entire apartment that I knew for a fact Julian would never, ever think to open. The thick manila envelope felt heavy in my hands as I slid it back into the textbook. For a long moment, I hesitated. Was I really prepared to go to war with the man I had once loved enough to sacrifice everything for? My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from my diner manager asking if I could cover an extra shift because someone had called in sick. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh out loud. I was still scrambling for hours and spare change while my husband was leasing luxury penthouses. That night I made a decision. Before the lawyers and the courtrooms and the ugliness, Julian deserved one last chance to do the right thing, and I deserved one last chance to look him in the eye when he refused. I arrived at the Innovate Logistics headquarters just after 6 in the evening, guessing that most of the employees would have already left for the day. The receptionist, a young woman I'd never seen before, looked up startled as I walked through the glass doors. "I'm sorry, ma'am, we're closed for appointments. You'll need to— I'm here to see Julian Croft," I said, cutting her off with a firm tone I hadn't used in years. "I'm his wife." Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I didn't realize. Let me see if he's available." 5 minutes later, I was ushered into a massive corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city I had once felt I owned. Julian sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his expression carefully, unnervingly neutral. "This is unexpected, Alara," he said, not even bothering to stand up. "I thought we agreed to communicate through our attorneys." "No, Julian, you decided that. I never agreed to anything." I remained standing, deliberately ignoring the plush leather chair he half-heartedly gestured toward. I wanted to hear it from you directly. "After everything we've been through, after everything I sacrificed for you." He let out a long, weary sigh and glanced pointedly at his expensive watch. "Here we go again with the sacrifices. Nobody forced you to work those jobs, Alara. That was your choice. You didn't force me, but you were certainly happy to benefit from them. 7 years, Julian. I put you through 7 years of building this company from nothing. And I'm compensating you fairly for that time," he said, his voice hardening. "The settlement offer is more than generous." I let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded hollow and brittle even to my own ears. 6 months of your current salary in exchange for 7 years of my life. That's your definition of generous? What exactly do you think you're entitled to?" He shot back, his voice taking on a sharp, defensive edge. "You didn't write a single line of code. You didn't pitch to a single investor. You didn't build any of the client relationships. I kept a roof over our heads. I paid for the prototypes, the equipment, the conference fees you couldn't afford. I paid for everything. Those were small contributions in the grand scheme of things." The casual, cold dismissal of my life's work felt like a physical blow. In that instant, I finally truly understood that the man I had married was gone. Or maybe he had never really existed at all. "Are you sleeping with Chloe?" I asked, the question blunt and brutal, leaving no room for evasion. His momentary hesitation, the quick, guilty flicker of something in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. "My personal life," he replied coldly, recovering his composure, "is no longer your concern." "It became my concern when you were still sharing my bed while you were pursuing her. Were all those late nights at the office really about work?" Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "I don't have to justify myself to you. Chloe understands what it takes to build something meaningful. She supports my vision without constantly complaining about money or needing my attention. I supported your vision when it was nothing but a few lines of code on a secondhand laptop. I supported you when we were eating instant ramen 4 nights a week so you could afford to buy server space." Before he could respond, the office door opened without a knock. Eleanor stood there, her perfectly coiffed hair and designer suit making me acutely aware of my worn-out waitress uniform and scuffed shoes. "I thought I heard raised voices," she said, her eyes narrowing as they landed on me with undisguised contempt. "Julian, you shouldn't be speaking to her alone." "That's what we're paying Mr. Harrington for." "We," I echoed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Since when are you paying for anything, Eleanor?" She stepped fully into the room, closing the door softly behind her like a predator cornering its prey. "I have always been my son's strongest advocate. Something you clearly failed at." "She was just leaving," Julian said, his tone dismissive as he straightened his tie, avoiding my gaze. Eleanor placed a perfectly manicured hand on her son's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "Darling, this is exactly what I warned you about for years." The very moment you finally achieve real success, she shows up with her hand out making demands. "I'm making demands?" I was incredulous. "I came here hoping for one honest conversation with my husband." "Ex-husband," Eleanor corrected smoothly, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Or he will be, very soon. The papers have been filed." "I'm aware." They were served to me between my shifts at one of those jobs you both seem to think don't qualify as real work. For a fraction of a second, Julian at least had the decency to look slightly embarrassed. The timing sounded like it wasn't intentional. Nothing ever is with you, is it? I moved toward the door, then paused, my hand on the cool metal handle. "Just tell me one thing. Was any of it real? Did you ever actually love me? Or was I just a convenient source of funding until something better came along?" His eyes met mine for a fleeting, unreadable moment, then slid away to the glittering city skyline outside his window. "We just wanted different things, Alara. It's that simple." "Such a shame," Eleanor added, unable to resist one final twist of the knife. "All those years you wasted on someone who clearly was never your equal. But you've upgraded nicely now, darling." As if on cue, Chloe appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from professional confusion to a cool, calculated assessment when she saw me standing there. "Sorry to interrupt, Julian. The investors are on the conference line for the quarterly review." "We'll be right there," Julian replied, the gratitude for the interruption evident in his voice. I looked at the three of them, my husband, his mother, his mistress, a perfect self-contained triangle of betrayal, and in that moment I felt something inside me finally break free. It wasn't my heart. That had been breaking slowly, piece by piece, for months. This was different. This was the last frayed thread of hope that there might be some amicable resolution, some quiet acknowledgement of our shared history. It snapped. "Goodbye, Julian," I said quietly, and walked past Chloe without a second glance. That night, I sat alone in what had once been our apartment, surrounded by the modest furnishings we had collected over 7 years of struggle. The photos of us smiling and hopeful from a lifetime ago still hung on the walls. They were evidence of a happier time, of the dreams we had once shared. I took them down, one by one. For 3 days, I moved through my shifts like an automaton, serving food, taking orders, driving strangers across town, all while a storm of emotion raged inside me. The initial shock gave way to a crushing sadness, which then curdled into something I hadn't expected, a deep, white-hot anger. Not just at Julian or Eleanor or Chloe, but at myself, for believing in someone who had only ever seen me as a stepping stone, for making myself smaller and smaller to fit into the tiny space he allowed for me in his life, for completely, utterly forgetting my own worth. On the 4th day, I called in sick to all 3 of my jobs. Instead, I drove to the old university library where I had once spent countless hours studying finance. The place where the ambitious, confident Alara Vance had meticulously planned her rise through the corporate world, long before she ever met Julian Croft. I pulled my old textbook from a dusty box in my closet and removed the Paris prenup from its hiding place between the pages. Then I called the number of an attorney a regular customer at the diner had once scribbled on a napkin for me, just in case. Her name was Evelyn Reed, and she answered on the second ring. "This is Alara Vance," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "I understand you specialize in complex divorce cases, particularly those involving businesses and hidden assets." "I do," she replied, her voice calm and professional. "Why don't you tell me your situation?" As I began to lay out the entire 7-year story, from the corner office to the courthouse, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. The first small sparks of determination were beginning to glow in the cold ashes of what had been my life. This wasn't just about money or getting revenge anymore. This was about reclaiming 7 years of my life that had been systematically erased. It was about standing up and finally being counted. It was about becoming visible again. Evelyn Reed was everything I needed in a lawyer, sharp, uncompromising, and completely undeterred by Julian's newfound status and wealth in the business community. Unfortunately, her expertise came with a price tag that threatened to completely drain my meager savings within a matter of weeks. "I can offer you a payment plan," she suggested during our second meeting, her sharp eyes softening for just a moment as she took in my worn-out blazer. "But I won't sugarcoat this for you, Alara. Going up against a well-funded opponent like your husband and his team is going to be a battle." "I've been living on challenging for 7 years," I replied, a grim resolve settling over me like armor. "I'm not backing down now." By the time the first court date arrived, I had pawned my engagement ring just to cover Evelyn's initial retainer fee. The small, simple diamond had once seemed like the most precious thing in the world to me. I remembered how Julian had saved for months to buy it, how his hands had trembled when he proposed. Now, it just represented one more sacrifice in a long, painful line of them. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, dressed in the only business suit I still owned, a charcoal gray outfit I had purchased for interviews long before I'd ever met Julian. It was slightly outdated in its cut and hung a bit too loosely on my frame, a silent testament to the years of running between jobs and forgetting to eat. Evelyn met me on the courthouse steps, her sleek leather briefcase and unshakable confidence, a stark contrast to my own nervous energy. "Remember what we discussed," she said quietly as we walked through the metal detectors. "Stay calm. Answer only what is asked of you, and let me handle all the objections. Let them underestimate you." We were the first to arrive in the assigned courtroom, a tactical decision on Evelyn's part to help settle my nerves and let us claim our space. 20 minutes later, the doors swung open with a practiced theatrical timing. Julian entered first, wearing a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. Behind him strode a phalanx of 4 attorneys from Harrington Walsh, one of the city's most prestigious and notoriously ruthless law firms. Chloe followed, dressed in a conservative navy dress that successfully communicated professional colleague rather than other woman. Her eyes met mine for a brief, cold second before sliding away. And last, of course, came Eleanor. She made her entrance as if she were arriving at a society gala, dressed in a cream designer suit and dripping with pearls. She placed a protective hand on Julian's shoulder as they took their seats on the opposite side of the aisle, deliberately angling her body to create a visual barrier between her son and me. "Well?" Evelyn murmured under her breath. "They certainly aren't skimping on the dramatics." Judge Harrison entered the courtroom precisely at 9 o'clock. A woman in her mid-60s with silver hair pulled back into a severe bun. She commanded immediate respect with a single stern glance across the room. "Let's dispense with any unnecessary theatrics," she announced after the preliminary introductions were made. "Croft versus Vance, petition for dissolution of marriage. I have reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Harrington, you may begin." Lawrence Harrington, senior partner and lead counsel for Julian, approached the podium with the easy confidence of a man who rarely, if ever, lost. "Your Honor, this is a very straightforward matter. My client, Mr. Julian Croft, the founder and CEO of Innovate Logistics, is seeking an equitable dissolution of his marriage to Elara Vance. We've offered a more than generous settlement, which Mrs. Vance has, for reasons we find inexplicable, rejected." "We reject the characterization of generous, Your Honor," Evelyn countered smoothly, rising to her feet. "My client contributed substantially, both financially and through her labor, to the building of Mr. Croft's business over the 7 years of their marriage. The proposed settlement represents a mere fraction of her rightful share." Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps then we should establish for the court exactly what contributions Mrs. Vance made to her husband's remarkable business success. What followed was a systematic, brutal dismantling of my life. Harrington called Julian to the stand first, skillfully guiding him through a carefully constructed narrative that painted him as a lone visionary, a brilliant entrepreneur who had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing through sheer grit and individual genius. When the questioning finally turned to me, the tone shifted dramatically. "Mr. Croft, what sort of employment did your wife maintain during your marriage?" Julian cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over my head. "Elara, she worked various jobs, mostly in the service industry. Could you be more specific for the court?" Harrington pressed. "She was a waitress at the Oakwood Diner. She drove for a rideshare company. I believe she did some part-time administrative work for a few small businesses as well. And did she have any formal role at Innovate Logistics?" "No," Julian replied, his voice firm and unwavering. "She helped with some basic accounting in the very, very beginning, but to be frank, we outgrew her skill level very quickly." Each word landed like a physical slap. 7 years of my life, reduced to various jobs and skills that were quickly outgrown. When it was my turn to take the stand, Harrington approached with an air of practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Vance, could you tell the court about your current employment situation?" "I currently work 3 jobs," I said, my voice tight but steady. "I'm an administrative assistant at Westbrook Medical Center during the day. I waitress 4 evenings a week, and I drive for a rideshare service on the weekends. And what is your approximate annual income from these combined positions?" I had to swallow hard against the lump of humiliation in my throat. "Approximately $43,000 last year. Less than 1/10 of your husband's current salary," Harrington observed casually, letting the fact hang in the silent air. "Would you say that financial considerations played a significant role in your decision to marry Mr. Croft?" "Objection!" Evelyn was on her feet instantly. Argumentative and deeply offensive, Your Honor. Sustained. Judge Harrison agreed, eyeing Harrington coolly. Counsel will refrain from such insinuations. But the damage was done. The narrative was being carefully, deliberately constructed for the judge. Julian, the brilliant provider, and me, the underemployed wife now seeking a lottery-sized payday. The questioning continued relentlessly for what felt like hours, picking apart every financial decision, every career choice I had ever made. Why had I really left a promising career at Apex Capital? Why hadn't I pursued other opportunities in the finance world? Wasn't it true that I had chosen these menial jobs because they were less demanding, requiring less commitment? By the lunch recess, I was emotionally exhausted. In the courthouse bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, my reflection looking pale and haunted in the harsh fluorescent light. "You're doing great, Alara," Evelyn assured me, squeezing my shoulder. "Don't let him get to you." The judge isn't buying their character assassination. I've been watching her. She's watching you. The afternoon session brought Eleanor to the stand, perfectly coiffed and thoroughly rehearsed. "Mrs. Croft," Harrington began, his tone respectful, "how would you characterize your son's marriage?" Eleanor adjusted her pearls, a picture of maternal concern. "Julian is an exceptionally generous man. He supported Alara's choices, even when they significantly limited their lifestyle. He never pressured her to find more suitable employment. And did you ever observe Mrs. Vance contributing to your son's business in any meaningful way?" "Not in any meaningful way, no," Eleanor replied with an air of practiced regret. "Julian built that company through his own sleepless nights and his own brilliant innovation. Alara always seemed content to remain on the periphery." Her testimony went on and on, a masterclass in passive aggression, painting a portrait of a brilliant young entrepreneur burdened by an unambitious wife, who now had the audacity to claim credit for his hard-won success. She always seemed quite fascinated by the potential financial rewards, though, Eleanor added, as if it were an afterthought. Always asking about investors and funding rounds, rather than the technology itself. By late afternoon, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt stifling and heavy. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess before they were to begin closing arguments. "We're not waiting for closing arguments," I whispered frantically to Evelyn as soon as we were in the hallway. "We're not waiting another minute. They're burying me alive. I can't sit here and listen to another hour of this." When the proceedings resumed, Harrington launched into his practiced, eloquent summation of the case, his voice resonating with confidence. The judge listened impassively, her face an unreadable mask. But then, Julian did something unexpected. He interrupted his own attorney. "Your Honor, if I may speak directly?" he asked, with the unearned confidence of someone who is not used to being told no. Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow but gave a slight permissive nod. Julian turned slightly in his seat, ensuring his profile was directed toward me, but that his words would carry to the entire courtroom. I built something meaningful. Something that now employs 30 people and helps hundreds of small businesses thrive. I did that, not Alara. His voice hardened, filled with a righteous, self-serving indignation. "She's only after my wealth," he sneered, looking directly at me for the first time all day, his expression one of pure contempt. "She never even worked a real job." The courtroom fell silent. 7 years of sacrifice, reduced to a public mockery. His mother, Eleanor, sat behind him, nodding smugly in agreement. I stood up, my legs trembling, but my voice steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this prenup from Paris." The manila envelope felt warm in my hands as I passed it to Evelyn, who approached the bench with measured, confident steps. Judge Harrison accepted the document, a flicker of genuine curiosity in her eyes. "A prenuptial agreement?" she asked, her gaze falling on the first page. "Mr. Harrington, were you aware of the existence of this document?" Harrington's composure finally cracked. He shot a panicked glance back at Julian, whose face had transformed from smug confidence to a mask of dawning, ashen horror. "Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of any such agreement. We would certainly question its authenticity and its relevance at this late stage of the proceedings." Evelyn smiled, a thin, sharp smile that was all business. The document is dated and notarized in Paris, France, 7 years ago during the couple's honeymoon. It bears Mr. Croft's signature, which can be verified by the court's own expert if necessary. Judge Harrison adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the pages with rapidly increasing interest. "This appears to be in order. Would you care to summarize the relevant portions for the court, Miss Reed?" "Certainly, Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the stunned silence. "The prenuptial agreement explicitly acknowledges my client's direct financial contributions to the founding of Innovate Logistics. It categorizes these contributions as sweat equity and thereby establishes Mrs. Vance as a 49% owner of the company and all its related intellectual property." A wave of murmurs erupted in the courtroom. Across the aisle, Julian was whispering frantically to Harrington, who looked equally blindsided and pale. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her expression a chaotic mix of disbelief and pure, unadulterated outrage. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice rising above the commotion, "the agreement contains a specific clause stipulating that in the event of a divorce, Mrs. Vance's ownership stake would be recognized independently from any standard divorce settlement." Judge Harrison silenced the room with a single sharp rap of her gavel. "Mr. Croft, do you recognize your signature on this document?" Julian stood up slowly, tugging at the collar of his expensive shirt, which suddenly seemed far too tight. "Your Honor, I may have signed something in Paris, but I wasn't fully aware of the contents. It was our honeymoon. There was champagne involved. Are you suggesting you were intoxicated when you signed a legally binding document, Mr. Croft?" the judge asked, her tone making it crystal clear that this was not a favorable line of defense. Not intoxicated, perhaps, but not fully cognizant of what I was signing. I couldn't help but speak up, my own voice cutting in. He was sober enough to meet with investors that very same day and secure our first round of funding. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Ms. Reed, please continue." Evelyn then proceeded to meticulously enumerate the years of multiple jobs I had worked, the specific amounts I had contributed to business expenses, and the hundreds of unpaid hours I had devoted to bookkeeping and administrative support during the company's most vulnerable early days. "Mrs. Vance didn't simply support her husband emotionally, Your Honor," Evelyn declared, her voice filled with conviction. "She financially underwrote his entire dream while working 3 jobs simultaneously. Innovate Logistics exists today because of her sacrifice and her direct financial investment." For the next 20 minutes, the entire narrative of the trial was rewritten. I was no longer the gold-digging wife seeking an unearned payday. Instead, the portrait that emerged was of a woman who had invested years of her labor and tens of thousands of dollars into a partnership, only to be systematically erased from the story once success finally arrived. Judge Harrison listened intently, her gaze shifting between the 2 legal teams. As Evelyn concluded her presentation, the judge removed her glasses and addressed the entire courtroom. "I am recessing for 30 minutes to review this document thoroughly. When we reconvene, I will deliver my preliminary ruling on the matter of property division and ownership recognition." Her gaze swept across Julian's shell-shocked legal team. "I would suggest you use this time to confer with your client about a more realistic approach to a settlement." In the hallway outside, Evelyn squeezed my arm gently. "That went better than we could have ever hoped." The judge clearly sees the inequity of their position. Before I could even respond, Harrington approached us, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by a sheen of desperate sweat on his brow. "Miss Reed, Mrs. Vance, a word?" He glanced around the crowded corridor, ensuring their privacy. My client is prepared to offer a significantly improved settlement if you're willing to negotiate this outside the courtroom. I thought of all the nights I had spent driving strangers across town while Julian worked on his code. I thought of the holidays I had missed with my family because I couldn't afford to take time off from my jobs. I thought of the dreams I had deferred year after year while I was busy nurturing his. 49%, I replied calmly, my voice unwavering. That part is not negotiable. But I am willing to discuss the terms for how we might structure a business relationship moving forward. When we reconvened, Judge Harrison wasted no time on preamble. Having thoroughly reviewed the prenuptial agreement presented to this court, I find it to be valid and legally binding. Mrs. Vance is hereby recognized as owning 49% of Innovate Logistics and all its related assets. She peered at Julian over the top of her glasses. Mr. Croft, this court takes a very dim view of attempts to mischaracterize marital contributions, particularly when there is documented evidence that so clearly contradicts those claims. Across the aisle, Eleanor was clutching her pearls so tightly I thought the string might snap. Chloe was staring straight ahead, her face a blank mask, carefully avoiding eye contact with anyone. Julian himself looked as if he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Furthermore, the judge continued, given Mrs. Vance's now recognized significant ownership stake in a growing company, I am denying the motion for spousal support as it is entirely unnecessary. The parties will attend mediation to determine how to structure their business relationship moving forward, or alternatively, to negotiate a buyout of Mrs. Vance's interest at fair market value. As we left the courtroom, I felt strangely hollow. The victory was complete, the vindication absolute, but nothing could change the fact that 7 years of my life had still been reduced to percentages and dollar amounts. No legal ruling could ever restore the trust that had been lost, not just my trust in Julian, but my trust in my own judgment. Outside on the courthouse steps, a small group of reporters had gathered, alerted to the unexpected twist in what had appeared to be a routine, high-profile divorce. Evelyn fielded their questions expertly while I stood silently beside her, still processing the whirlwind of the day's events. Mrs. Vance, how does it feel to be revealed as the hidden partner behind Innovate Logistics' success? One reporter called out. Before I could even formulate an answer, a familiar voice cut through the clamor. "Ilara isn't speaking today," Julian announced, emerging from the courthouse with his entourage trailing behind him like defeated soldiers. "This is a private matter that we will resolve professionally." I met his gaze directly for the first time since his courtroom outburst. "Actually," I said, my voice clear and carrying over the noise, "I think I've been silent long enough." Turning to the reporters, I spoke with a clarity and confidence that surprised even myself. Innovate Logistics was built on a foundation of partnership, sacrifice, and a shared vision. I look forward to its continued success. Whether I remain involved or not will depend entirely on how genuine the commitment to that partnership proves to be moving forward. 1 year later, I stood at the window of my own downtown office, watching the city lights flicker to life as dusk settled over Port Meridian. After months of tense, grueling negotiation, Julian and I had finally reached an agreement. It was a structured buyout of my entire ownership stake, with the payment spread over 5 years to avoid destabilizing the company he had built. The terms were favorable enough to allow me to launch Vance Financial Advisors, a firm specializing in helping female entrepreneurs secure funding and, most importantly, protect their interests. The irony was not lost on me. My years of struggling alongside Julian had given me a real-world education that no business school could ever provide. My assistant knocked gently on the door before entering. "Your 5 o'clock is here, Ilara, and these were just delivered for you." She placed a large bouquet of white lilies on my desk alongside a small, crisp envelope. Inside, A brief note was scrawled in Julian's familiar, looping handwriting. "Congratulations on the Forbes feature. You deserve all the recognition. -J." The magazine had named me one of their entrepreneurs to watch, highlighting both my new venture and the dramatic story behind it. The article had been fair, I thought, acknowledging Julian's technical brilliance while finally crediting my financial stewardship during those critical, lean early years. I didn't respond to the note. Some bridges, once they are burned to the ground, are better left as monuments to lessons learned. But I did keep the flowers. That evening, as I met my friends for dinner, my real friends, the ones who had stood by me through the darkest days, I found myself laughing, a deep, genuine laugh, for what felt like the first time in years. The immense weight that had been pressing down on me for so long had finally completely lifted. I had reclaimed not just my financial worth, but something far more valuable. I had reclaimed my voice, and this time, I would never let anyone silence it again. End of story.